February 2025 meeting of the Environmental Quality Board, or EQB. My name is Nancy Dobbenberger, and privileged to serve as Commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Transportation, and honored to be serving as the chair for the EQB. I also want to mention, so since this is an all virtual meeting, at this point and going forward, we're going to be sure for all agenda items, rather than a aye or nay vote on some of the things that we have done in the past, for when the board members are all in the room, we will do a roll call vote. It was flagged that there could be challenges, and I've been mute button challenged, of course, in the past on meetings, and so we want to make sure we hear from everybody. So that will be a little bit different than in the past, where on some things we've just done a aye or nay vote. We will do roll call votes on things that need to be voted on when we are all virtual. And even in the hybrid situations where we have some virtual, we will be doing that. So wanted to mention that here on the onset. And with that, I will turn it over to our Executive Director, Catherine Nischler, for the roll call.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. So this the who's here roll call as opposed to voting here. Commissioner Arnold. I think, is Deputy Commissioner Wyckoff with us on behalf of Commerce?
It looks like he's just coming in.
Okay. Board Member Bakken. Board Member.
Hi, I'm here.
Board Member Brandt.
Present.
Commissioner Cunningham, I don't believe is joining us. Is Assistant Commissioner Kunis with us? Chair Dobbenberger. Here. Commissioner Grunwald. Commissioner Grunwald. Board Member Hintz. Here. Board Member Katzenberger.
Good afternoon, I am here.
Commissioner Kessler.
I'm here as well.
Board Member Martin. Board Member Martin.
Yes, here.
Commissioner Verelak. Board Member Nelson.
Present.
Commissioner Peterson. I don't believe we were expecting him. Is Steve Roos, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Board Member Smith.
Here.
Commissioner Stroman, I believe, had a conflict. I see Deputy Director Kuski. Are you here with us?
Yes.
Chair Holman.
Alive and well.
Excellent. Chair Zelli, don't believe can join us. Do I see Council Member Vento?
Present.
Excellent. I'm going to just double check again. Do we have Commissioner Arnold or Board Member Bakken?
You Steve Wyckoff's here as
Oh, great.
for
Thank you.
Arnold. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, Madam Chair, we do have 10 members today and a quorum is 9, so proceed.
Great, thank you. So then next on the agenda is the approval of the consent agenda, which are the meeting minutes from the December 18th, 2024 EQB meeting. That's in your packet, page 5. And the preliminary agenda for the January 15th, 2025, today's EQB meeting, and that's packet page 3. I saw a hand up. Go ahead, Board Member Nelson. Board Member Bucket. Nelson, excuse me.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just had a quick amendment maybe on the minutes. It mentions that I was present. I actually was not present at the December meeting minutes or December meeting.
Thank you, Board Member Nelson. We will make that correction. the minutes. So with that, is there a motion to approve of the minutes with that correction, as well as today's preliminary agenda?
Member Katzenberger, so moved.
And this is Commissioner Kessler. I'll second that.
Thank you. All right, so any discussion on the motion? All right, with that, so we do need to do a roll call.
Do the roll call. All right, on the motion to approve the minutes as corrected and the agenda, Commissioner Arnold is not present. Board Member Bakken. He was not present. Board Member Bauer-Kemper.
Yes.
Board Member Brands.
Yes.
I believe Commissioner Cunningham is not present. Chair Daubenberger.
Yes.
Commissioner Gronvall. Commissioner Gronvall joined us. Board Member Hint.
Yes.
Board Member Katzenberger.
Yes.
Board Member or Commissioner Kessler.
Yes.
Board Member Martin. Board Member Martin.
Yes.
Commissioner Verlick is not with us. Board Member Nelson.
Yes.
Commissioner Peterson with us. Board Member Smith.
Yes.
Commissioner Stroman is not with us. Chair Holman
Aye.
is unanimous of the folks present.
Okay, so the motion carries and the minutes with that correction, as well as the preliminary agenda, are adopted. So now I'll turn it back to our Executive Director, Kathleen Nuschler, for the ED report.
All right, well, thank you, Chair, and thank you to everyone for joining us today for our first meeting of 2025. As we have emphasized, it was virtual, hoping for some of us that there might be snow. There isn't very much. It was a little chilly this morning, so thank you all. A few logistics. As we start, as we noted, the meeting is being recorded. You will also note that we have a new camera here. A couple of months ago, we borrowed a camera that tracks people who's speaking, and we liked it for when we have many of you in the room. So we ordered one, and it just came, and we're testing it out today. So if you see some strange things, we're trying to figure out how that camera is going to work. I did notice it got a little dark at one point, so we'll see how that goes. For those of you that are online, the meeting chat is open and visible to everyone, but we don't keep that as part of the meeting records, so it should only be used for logistical issues. Today, if you have particular input on the camera, we'll happily take that as part of the chat so that we can refine how we use it as we move forward. Board members, the presenters welcome your questions and feedback today. Use the raise hand function or jump in during discussions. You should be able to mute and unmute yourself. For members of the public, there's going to be 2 opportunities to give some input today. The first will be related to item 5, and then at the end of the meeting, there will be time for general comments. So when we get to the public comment part of the agenda, please use that raise hand button. We'll add your name to the list of commenters. If you're here in person, just let us know that you would like to comment, and we will cue you at that relevant point in the agenda. And a reminder that we will give you the power to unmute yourself, but then you will have to do that unmute on your own, and there might be a slight lag of the notification that says you can't unmute. And then if you need a reminder of these things that are on the slides, there are guidelines and guide to team participation in our packet and on our website. So, hey, moving on from the logistics, I just wanted to give a couple of brief project updates today. The biggest one is on the completion of the work of the Gas Resources Technical Advisory Committee. So they have finished their work to produce recommendations for a temporary regulatory framework for gas production within Minnesota. Those draft recommendations were released for input, and input was accepted through December 23rd. The team reviewed all the input to create final recommendations in a report that's due to the legislature today. In response to the input received, the EQB staff did make a few changes to our recommendations for environmental review. We are still recommending a mandatory EAW during the temporary framework for any gas development project that would require the recommended development permit from DNR. Some additional language was added to clarify that the requirement is to complete the EAW process under 4410, including the RGU decision about whether an EIS is needed for the project. So we wanted it to be very clear that it could proceed to an EIS, that we were not saying the EAW was the end of the process, because that's not how the process works. Based on tribal feedback, EQB staff have also added a recommendation that EAW publication and notification for a gas resource project be sent to Minnesota tribal governments and not just to the distribution list that we have laid out in our rules. So we think that requirement will help support communication and information sharing with tribal governments and their inclusion in the process. And finally, we just added some recommendations or some additional language that highlights the need for collaborative work in environmental review between all permitting agencies, because we suspect these kinds of projects will have a lot of permits. So we just made a recommendation that the responsible governmental unit, which is recommended to be the DNR, incorporate and work with all governmental units that might have regulatory authority to make sure that the environmental effects are properly understood and can be considered in all the permits that are being done. We think the general language of the EA environmental review process in 4410 really already speaks to a lot of this, but we thought it was worth emphasis. So if you're interested in that, the final document will be posted online at the GTAC website. I believe that will happen tomorrow or later this week, which is gasproductionrules.mn.gov. If you have any questions about our recommendations, Jesse Krasinski is the lead staff on that. And the point of the recommendations for the temporary framework is to inform legislation to create that temporary framework. So we'll keep you posted about that. And you will also hear about rulemaking as we begin to consider what long-term permanent rules we need for those types of projects within the environmental review program. That's really my main update for all of you. As most of you know, the Minnesota session started yesterday, the legislative session. I believe the governor's budget is going to be released tomorrow. We'll see what that brings for the state agencies. And we'll probably have more updates on EQB related items in the future meetings, hopefully in February. And so, Chair, I believe those are my key updates for all of you.
Thank you, Executive Director Neuschler. So are there any questions from board members on her update report? Board member Bauerkemper, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Executive Director Neuschler, for the updates. I am curious to gather a bit more information on why the EQB recommended, or I suppose I can say more simply, did not recommend a mandatory EIS for the gas resources project. Is that something I should reach out to Jesse to inquire about?
Yeah, you certainly could. I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
Okay,
but we
thanks.
also, that was a comment that we got, and we did work in our report to explain, you know, why we did or did not change things in response to comments. So there should be some information in the final report as well that explains the thinking on that.
All right, very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Bauerkemper. Any other questions, board members? Not seeing or hearing anything, then I think we can go ahead and move on in the agenda. That brings us to agenda item number 4, the Environmental Congress report out. And what's that? Oh, okay. So we have for the Environmental Congress report, our presenters are, besides Executive Director Neuschler, we have Priscilla Villa-Watt, our Communications and Engagement Coordinator for EQB. And I will turn it right over to Priscilla.
Yes, turn it right over to Priscilla.
All right. Go ahead, Priscilla. Thank you. Priscilla, are you speaking right now? We can't hear anything. Seems to be.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Over loud and
Thank you.
clear.
Great. Okay, let me share my screen again. And does that look okay?
Screen?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, so my name is Priscilla Villawatt. I'm our Communications and Engagement Coordinator at EQB, and I'll be talking about the 2024 Environmental Congress report out with y'all today. Here's just a short outline of the things that I'll be running through. So I'll go over the overview of the Congress, the MAD summary, and key takeaways, and the next steps that we'll be taking as a board. So first off, just a reminder of the 2024 Environmental Congress. We had 4 meetings across Minnesota that were selected based on where our current public board members are located, or trying to kind of divvy it up across the state. We did collaborate with multiple state or member agencies on the topics that we were going to be discussing at each event. And then each event was co-hosted by our EQB board members. And again, that sort of goes with how we selected the locations that we were going to hold our meetings. The main, the way that our agendas worked at the meetings is that we had small group conversations that were facilitated by the MAD group. And so they helped us come up with questions that we discussed at each event that helped people get to know each other, discuss their connection to the state's work, and then sort of what their feedback was on the work that the state agencies are doing in terms of what they could consider moving forward. So in the board packet, you will find a rather lengthy summary that was provided to us by MAD. And again, they're the state contractor who worked with us to develop the agendas and who gathered all of the notes that we had taken at the board meeting, and provided this really wonderful summary of what we heard at each of the meetings. And so what you'll find in there are, excuse me, overarching themes that emerged from each of those discussions. So just as a whole, sort of what we heard. You'll find that in the earlier part of the summary. It also includes specific agency feedback on each event in discussion. And I highly recommend that those agencies look at that feedback. I think it's really wonderful feedback that we heard from the public. And then it also provides a very detailed account of each of the discussions and the questions that we had from each of the small group discussions. So there's just a lot of really great information in there. I encourage everyone, if you haven't already, to review that summary, because there's just so many great takeaways, and I'm just really grateful that we were able to work with MAD and other state agencies for this event, because I think that really helped it make it as successful as it was. So in terms of key takeaways, so these you'll find in the board packet in the summary memo that is attached. And sort of these are the key takeaways for EQB. In the MAD summary, there's a lot of feedback that is specific to the state agency work that was presented on. But there is also some sort of overarching themes that we heard as staff from each of the meetings that EQB can be considering and implementing in our work moving forward. And so some of those key takeaways, or the 3 main takeaways that we that we're considering are relationship building. And there's specific notes in here to focus on relationships with folks who are in greater Minnesota and with those who are disproportionately impacted. And I think both of these relationship building in general is a part of our current strategic plan. So I think this really goes well with what we already have in our work plan. I think there's just a need for being more intentional about how and where we're building those relationships moving forward. The other key takeaway is engagement opportunities. And something that I wanted to note in here is that one of what we heard from the Environmental Congress is that the agenda and the way that the discussions were facilitated was really successful. People seem to generally like the meeting format. And so I think that's something that we definitely plan to use in the future when we're considering meetings around our work in particular, and making sure that we are building agendas that help people have discussions amongst themselves and prepare questions that can help them have the conversations that they want to have with us as well. So that's just something to consider when we are planning for future events. And engagement opportunities are generally just like, how are we connecting with people out in the public? What are those like meetings that we can be planning for other than the Environmental Congress, but other types of events that might attract people to our work and allow there to be more back and forth conversation. And then the last key takeaway is improved communication. And this is sort of just generally how we're communicating on the work that we're doing. I think people are really curious to hear success stories in particular and what's been going well and sort of the progress of the work that we're doing. Something that I wanted to note also with this particular piece are indicators to consider in future reports. So in the summary memo, you'll see a list of key indicators that people are looking for in how we're doing our communication. So I mentioned a couple, right? So like where are we successful? What does progress look like? And then also, how are we creating outreach plans for our work and making sure that the right people are hearing about the work that we're doing and having the opportunity to either engage with our work or just learn about it and implement, some of the projects or policies or what have you into their industry or business or just in their lives. And so I think that's something that's also really interesting that we took away from the Congress. And then lastly, next steps. So I just sort of wanted to take the opportunity to acknowledge that EQB staff, and we've heard from the board at the last board meeting, are really wanting to consider how we are working on engagement. And I think one of the key things that I've been hearing is making sure that we're improving transparency and accountability. And I know I'm like skipping around here a little bit, but I think that's something that we heard from the Congress and we're hearing from our board. And so I think that's just something that's really key in keeping in mind in how we are doing our communication and engagement as a board. I think that the feedback that we heard from the Congress generally aligns with our strategic plan. And I think there's just more conversation that we're having as staff in terms of how we will get to those outcomes that we have listed in our strategic plan. And so those are conversations that we're currently still having, including working on our metrics as they relate to the strategic plan and sort of what those touch points are for engagement and communication with the public. I mentioned the board engagement discussion that we had last time. And I think, again, all of this sort of really aligns well. I think there's a lot of different moving parts that need to be considered, but I don't think, but I think they're all aligned. I think it's just a matter of sort of integrating the different feedback that we're hearing from the public, the interests that the board have, and then sort of our strategic plan and our current work plan and how all of that can sort of align to make sure that we are moving in the right direction when it comes to how the board is doing impeachment. And so with that, I think that's my last slide. I've got just a thank you slide at the end. So I'm happy to take any questions. I'll turn it back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Priscilla. And nice job pushing through that. Well, with that, first of all, I just want to say thanks for that summary. And again, thanks to the whole EQB team for all the work that went in, and Matt, along with EQB, for that went into the Environmental Congress. I got out of it. And so at this point, I will take questions or comments from board members. Chair Holman, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Chair. This is more of a follow-on kind of question. At our last meeting, we were talking about enhancing or doing more for communication and outreach and trying to be available and responsive to kind of statewide inputs. And I'm not sure we really came to resolution on that. You were there, obviously, to hear that, Priscilla. But it got into, should we be amending our bylaws, relative to inputs for communication? So my question really is, does this report kind of answer potential we need to do more questions or not? I wasn't quite sure. To me, it does. I really want to give a shout out both to the presentation, the outcomes, and then the work you all did to do the Congress input activity across the state. I thought that was a great success and glad to be a participant in it. So, but I'm just wondering, I don't have a question about do we need to do more, but other board members may and other public may. So I'm feeling good, but are you getting a sense there's still more to be done here?
Thank you for the question, Chair Holman. And not sure if Priscilla, you want to answer that, or Executive Director Nuschler take a shot at that?
I can take a shot at it. Well, I think as Priscilla said, what we're hearing is kind of similar threads of what we should be thinking about that's coming through the Congress that I think really lines up with some of what we had in our strategic plan. And as she said, kind of the question then has become like, how do we implement, what actions do we take to implement like the strategies that I think line up really well with what we're hearing. So, in following up on the feedback from the last meeting, Priscilla and I have had some preliminary conversations about some possible things we could put forward to all of you in terms of how do you want to continue that work. And so we have a couple of options that we've started thinking through that we will bring forward. It was a tight turnaround for this meeting with the holidays and the end of the year. But we were talking about things like, should we build out some of those specific actions and ways to measure them? And are there members of the board who want to be involved in developing that, or do we want to bring them, develop something like that and bring that back and talk about it very intentionally? So we'll come back with a couple of ideas that I think we're going to try to weave together the strategic plan, what we heard from the Congress and the conversation from last month, and present some options to you all.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions or comments from board members? Martin. Oh, Board Member Martin, go ahead.
Thank you, Priscilla. I appreciated the chance to participate in the St. Paul meeting and appreciated your report, and thanks also to MAD for their really detailed summary. One of the things I was wondering, this is maybe somewhat related to Commissioner Holman's question, but I got the sense from your report on the relationship building point that that EQB, that we weren't totally satisfied with the level of participation or sense that we were connecting with especially greater Minnesota and disproportionately impacted communities in the Congress. And I'm just curious if you have any initial ideas of other things that EQB might do on either of those groups. Not that those are single groups. There's a lot of groups within those, but like those big categories.
I think yes and no. Something that we've sort of been talking about with Rebecca and her pollinator work is trying to figure out if we can attend more events that are in greater Minnesota. I think there are opportunities for us to get outside of the Twin Cities metro area with the work that we do. And so I think it's just a matter of planning for when and where those are happening so that we can have presence in some of those events and places. And then I think to the second point about people who are disproportionately impacted, that is one of our outcomes in our strategic plan. And that's a bucket of work on its own. And so I don't know that we have figured out just yet what exactly that means in terms of the work we do and specific actions that we need to take, but it's certainly at the forefront of my mind. And I know Catherine and I have had some conversations about that. So we're still trying to suss out what that looks like. But it's certainly at the forefront of our conversation and what we're thinking.
Thank you.
Board Member Martin, any other questions or comments from board members? Seeing or hearing any, then move on to item number 5 in the agenda. So thank you again, Priscilla. And the next item is our environmental review projects list. We have for presenters, Executive Director Nuschler and Kayla Walsh, our Environmental Review Program Administrator for EQB. So welcome to Executive Director. You want to start?
Get started.
All right. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Chair. And I put in the chat, everybody, you see we're learning what this camera does, and it thinks you all are sitting where one of the ceiling microphones are, which is why it's trying to find you and pointing off into the room. So we're learning from that. And I appreciate your patience and hope no one is getting seasick from the panning camera. So today we're going to talk a little bit about this concept of refining our continuous improvement process by constructing an environmental review projects list. Big picture, what I'm really hoping is that this list, if we move forward with it, will support the staff, and especially me and Eris and the board as we do annual work planning moving forward, that it's going to help all of us understand how we are fulfilling our promise to work to continuously improve the program. And it has seemed from some of our recent conversations that we need to bring forward a bit more clarity about how we're considering important ideas that have been brought forward to us. So I'm going to start by stepping back and grounding us in the EQB's continuous improvement process, which was developed in 2022 and 2023. In 2022, Eris discussed developing this comprehensive continuous improvement program to better address program needs and updates in a strategic, transparent, and efficient manner. And I was digging back into some of those files, and they envisioned a deliverable of a continuous improvement process that provides a comprehensive list of needed program changes based on past and current program evaluation efforts and input from state and local RGUs, tribal nations, project proposers, and the public. A method for deliberating on and prioritizing program changes relative to available staff time and resources. A clear indication of action steps and the timeline and resources needed for them, and a regular process of updating the CI approach to address emerging concerns and new information. So that process was developed. It was approved by the board in 2023. And I would say there were 2 major outputs from that process: a list of criteria that define an effective program, building out from some of the big picture buckets of effectiveness that were already in rule, and a list of potential program improvements. And so one of the things we want to be sure we're doing is that we're keeping those 2 outputs really front and center in our work. So next slide, please, Sarah. So the next slide then shows the continuous improvement process, kind of the order we went through. And for that first run through the process that we did in 2023, we really did all of these steps. We solicited ideas, we scoped them, we evaluated them. And that culminated in a few projects that ended up on our fiscal 24 work plan and that were continued through to our fiscal 25 work plan. Go ahead, next slide, Sarah. In doing the planning to support the recommendations for the project on those work plans, the staff and I worked together to pick a few improvement ideas to bring forward to you all. And as we considered how a project to implement the improvement ideas we were looking at would lay out, we looked at some of these factors. And these planning considerations really help support those original goals of thinking about timelines and resources and what do we need to complete the project to do the improvements. Next slide. As we were all preparing the fiscal 25 work plan, we had some discussions at the board about just how many improvement ideas were on the list and how long it might take us to work through those that we've identified as important, and the drawbacks of potentially continuing to add to our list without adequate time to actually work to implement the program changes and to see them move forward. And to implement those improvements we had identified. So at that point, we discussed doing the idea solicitation component every 4 years. And I think lengthening that time between the solicitation of ideas means that we're going to have, more iterations of sort of this planning, reviewing, and implementation part of the process as we do annual work plans and discuss those at the board with the board. Next slide, please, Sarah. And so the fact that we're going to be doing this iterating more in the planning and review process, at least to me, made it clear that it would be really helpful to have some additional tools to support mine and the staff's consideration of projects for our work plan, and then to have productive conversations with all of you about the proposed work plan. Again, going back to this original concept that we were going to have a list and a method for prioritizing relative to resources and a clear indication of action steps. Again, we got a lot of improvement ideas. We all know that. And I know that having them all on a list or a large number of them on a list might create some expectations that we will do them all, and that those expectations are outsized compared to our resources. And that's something that we will have to clearly communicate. But I do think we need to build a shared way of understanding potential projects to implement improvements in ways that we can define and scope and plan, and then effectively discuss. In talking about doing this kind of list, it's not going to result in significant new evaluation of any projects at this time. And the projects list, as we've conceived it, is likely going to end up a bit more filtered and smaller than the list of all improvement ideas that we have. But really what we're trying to do is bring these things together, because we have improvement ideas that are kind of dispersed. They've come in from multiple projects. The CI process, there was some addition and discussion of some during the mandatory category report. There's ideas that bubble up in other ways, from technical assistance calls or conversations or just other needs that we hear. In addition, a lot of the improvement ideas that we have gotten might address similar concepts or components of the program, but the suggestions on what improvement is needed might vary widely, or they might be very vague. And similarly, or sort of actually on sort of the flip side, some of the improvement ideas are very specific to how something should be changed. And we don't know how that specific suggestion might serve the needs of multiple partners and stakeholders that might be interested in the overall program area. So having what I call kind of a graspable container, something we can get our arms around that gathers together the potential work, I hope would help us support better future work planning. Next slide, please, Sarah. So with that, we came up with this idea of putting together a projects list, which will be the centralized and accessible list of potential environmental review program improvement projects. It's going to provide documentation of the implementation needs and approach for the projects that would tackle highly scored improvement recommendations, which would include things like understanding how ready the improvement is, whether it's something that where we know what needs to be fixed, or if additional work is needed to ground truth the need for and the direction of any program changes. Partially because I think we really want to, and we want to understand if part of the work is, if evaluating the needs and details of work, that's work itself, right? Before we start doing it, sometimes there's a lot of groundwork to be laid. In addition, we want to convey some of the planning considerations for a broader range of ideas and potential projects. So when we're discussing what work we want to take on, I think it will be helpful to better understand the span and scope of potential projects to support us in our discussion of prioritization and to make best use of our capacity. And we also hope that this kind of list will better support future improvement idea solicitation by providing, more clarity on what's potentially on our plates and how we consider the scope of the projects. My main goal for the list is for it to support me and you in our discussions about work planning, but I think it will also help provide information to the public to discuss, to understand the choices that we're making within our limited capacity and provide more transparency about what we're doing with the public input we've received and help inform future idea submittals. So now that I have talked a little bit about what we want to accomplish, I'm going to turn it over to Kayla for some discussion of our preliminary concept of what the list might look like in terms of how it's structured. We don't have an actual list yet, and we didn't put one in your packet, and that was very intentional. We want first to talk through whether this kind of list is helpful and whether you think it will be helpful to you in future work planning discussions. Even though we aren't anticipating that putting this together would take a lot of evaluation or consist of a lot of evaluation of ideas, it will take staff time to put it together. And we want to make sure that it's time well spent and like working towards a tool that is useful to all of us. So with that, I really will turn it over to Kayla to walk through the general concept here.
Great, thank you. So now I'm going to share a little bit more about what that draft project list currently looks like and how we have it structured, like Catherine mentioned. So we are asking this list to do a lot of organizing for us and hoping that it really, again, turns those ideas into more concrete work items that puts them all into one place. So in balancing the needs of the board and the public as our audience, we've organized the draft list into these components. So each project will have an identified area of work that it relates to, some specific scoping that identifies the project itself, potential outcomes or products, even if those outcomes might be forming a team to make recommendations. And then we'll have a column with background info, mainly to say where the idea has come from. Is it from the continuous improvement or CI process? Is it from mandatory category report writing, technical assistance? How long has the problem been known for? And then lastly, some items will have already been through that CI matrix scoring from our first run through. So those will have a matrix score and others won't. And we also added a readiness score just to give a snapshot of how we think how ready the project might be to implement. And then lastly, we added a time estimate. So next slide, please. And this slide shows the matrix that we had talked about in building the continuous improvement process. This is that step 3 where staff evaluate if the project directly increases one of these 9 criteria or if it indirectly increases one of the criteria. Those criteria are scientific integrity, environmental protection, measurability, inclusivity, user-friendliness, accessibility, consistency, quality assurance, and accountability. And you can see here they all align with an objective for environmental review in Rule 4410. And they were all clearly called out as defining an effective program during our building of the CI process. So if a project on this list would have gone through that CI process, then it would have a score. But again, some projects kind of emerged after the CI work, and so those would not have a matrix score. We can move on to the next slide. And then the most that a project could score for the matrix would be a 12. So anything with 9 points or above, we said was high, 6 to 8 would be medium, and 5 or below is low. And then we also introduced this readiness score where a 1 would indicate staff feel like there's more work to do in order to figure out what the true underlying problem or root cause might be. A score of a 2 means that there seems to be some general agreement, maybe among staff and all of the commenting parties on that problem, but there's a need to lay out some possible solutions and pick a pathway forward. And then a 3 would indicate general agreement on a solution, or it's a straightforward solution. And so we have 2 examples here of how this information would be displayed. And I have it broken down into 2 following slides so we can really zoom in into this chart, but this kind of gives you a sense of how it would appear in a document. So we can go ahead and move forward. So this is the first couple columns here show you the work areas where we identify health impacts and cumulative impacts as 2 things that, we received a ton of interest in. So during the CI process and the mandatory category report process, many people referred to these items. They wanted them included. We heard a lot of different suggestions, though, on exactly how to include them, how to accomplish that. So these ideas need to be considered holistically under this larger umbrella theme or topic. So health impacts is that larger topic, and then EQB staff can contextualize them and identify best pathways forward and resource needs for implementation. And so that's really why the project is to determine the best way to incorporate health impacts into environmental review, with potential work products being starting a working group that could eventually make education or training materials, or even help to chart out how to include health more explicitly through things like the EAW form, and really any other ideas that working group could come up with. And then the row for cumulative impacts is very similar, with the project being defining how cumulative impacts and potential effects relate to one another after MPC's cumulative impacts rulemaking, so we can sort of consider improving our guidance and mapping and beginning our own rulemaking to clarify terminology if that's necessary. So we can move on to the next slide. This again is just showing those health impacts, how long they have been talked about in that first row, and adding that both health and cumulative impacts in the second row were both key themes in the CI and the mandatory category report processes. Both were represented by previous CI work, so they went through the matrix and they received high rankings. And since both require a little more of that research, group work, and level setting, we gave them a 2 for their readiness score. And then lastly, the time estimate here we put just as an example to show how we could fill this in. So no worries if it's not exact or accurate for today's purposes, just an example. So we can go to the next slide, please, Sarah. Like Catherine mentioned, EQB received a ton of ideas, and a lot of those improvement ideas would need more research and definition and scoping and evaluation to move them forward before we can engage on those potential solutions. But we hope that this list starts to translate those big ideas into more graspable projects. So before launching into our next CI process, those steps that Catherine shared earlier, that both the public and the board can view this list and see and use that as maybe an example of a useful format for project ideas, or even for folks to say, I see this project on your list and I want you to prioritize that, or I want you to tackle that with a specific lens in mind. So in that way, I think we hope that it can support future solicitation for CI ideas. And what really struck me in the CI work in the beginning of it was how many times the environmental review program had been evaluated in the past, but certain ideas or the ideas in those reports, they hadn't been documented in one place. So they hadn't really moved forward consistently or were tracked consistently. And so I hope that this list can keep track of these ideas a little bit better for our work planning now and in the future. So for next steps, after today's discussion, we will finish building the list with the agreed upon framework, depending on your feedback. And EQB staff will work with tech reps to align on those readiness scores and the timing columns, and hopefully that wouldn't be a big lift. But then once it feels complete, we could publish the list on our website so it can be used as, again, a menu to help inform our next work plan for environmental review. And so we really want the list to work for everyone. That's why we're bringing it all to you for discussion and for your advisement on any potential changes. And we would like to know if this is helpful for you, if you have this list for future work planning conversations. And if not, maybe how could it be more useful? And if the content and layout don't particularly help, what could we change or what else could we consider to be added information? And so with that, I would be happy to hand it back over to you, Madam Chair, but we can leave this slide up for discussion if you like. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kayla and Director Nuschler. And yes, we wanted to have a robust discussion on this today. And as Director Nuschler mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, we do have a public comment period at the end after the board discussion as well, in addition to the usual public comment period at the end, but one just for this. So with that, any board members have some thoughts on this? Questions or comments, share any thoughts, please raise your hand or just jump in. Go ahead, Commissioner Kessler.
Thanks, Chair Domberger and Kayla. Thanks for this. I think this will be helpful as we try to track what we've worked on, what we said we're going to work on, and what we've heard about those things in the past. You touched on this a little bit, but I think it would be helpful if you would clarify for me how the projects list and the CI work will proceed or be informed by the evaluation of this matrix. So like each project will be put through, or each idea will be put through this matrix. Is that something that will happen and then engagement will happen on the output of the matrix, or we're going to gather ideas and then prioritize? How do you decide what goes through the matrix from the giant list, or is it, and when does engagement occur? Does that make sense?
Go ahead, Kayla. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Commissioner Kessler. I think that we're very open to suggestions on how that should work. I know that we potentially could score everything. Staff could score everything that we have in the projects list on the matrix, so that everything could have a score. Or we could wait until we do the next continuous improvement process and we do that solicitation for ideas, and then run all those new ideas and the existing project ideas all through the matrix scoring at once at that time. So I think those are our two main options. I don't know if Director Nuschler, if you have any other thoughts on that you want to share.
Sure. I think, right, when we went through it the first time, we did the solicitation, and then the improvement ideas were scored individually. And I kind of envisioned that this project's listed, like a project might bring together a couple of improvement ideas that hopefully have similar scores. And then, as Kayla said, we could try to score things that don't have any score, or we could just leave it as is, and kind of, again, thinking that this list might ground the next solicitation, we would do like a complete scoring after the next public input period in a couple of years.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? Then how will we be prioritizing work on projects from the list between now and the next solicitation? Based on the scores?
I think it will be based on the scores and on some discussion. We have the work on our current work plan, which some of which is not finished. The climate work certainly is responsive to a lot of the improvement ideas that we have. I know we've had a lot of discussion about health impacts and moving that forward. So I guess I kind of feel like we have enough stuff we know we want to do that was highly listed from the list we have now, that's not going to be an extremely difficult conversation. I think
right.
It's fairly
and
clear.
I agree. We have plenty to do, and And I think all, the priorities that are set in the work plan make sense. I don't want the board to be setting false expectations where we solicit a giant amount of ideas and run it through a matrix, and then we have the ability to do like 2 things. And then the next time it comes around, we get all of the things we didn't do last time, plus a whole bunch more, and we can only do 4 things or something. So I'm just trying to balance setting expectations, doing quality work, and then also making sure that when we have the opportunity to engage with the public and others on what the priorities should be, that we can have an honest conversation about the way to influence the work that the EQB is doing.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Kessler. I have the same concern about new input coming in through future solicitations as well. And, I think in doing that, we could certainly see where some input would fit in with what we're already working on, what might already be something we can incorporate into our list. And then some other things might be brand new, I just feel like big add-ons to the list, and prioritizing that with the priorities that we, have in place as we go into a future solicitation. We'll have to think through how we do that. But agree that we need to be thinking about how we manage the workload of all that comes in. I will just say too, I do like this idea of the one-stop shopping for all that we have going on. But I will go to, I see, unless there is anything else you wanted to add, Commissioner Kessler, before we go on to Board Member Nelson. Okay. Board Member Nelson, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do want to echo, I think the list is good. Also echo Commissioner Kessler's thing about expectations. And kind of in that line, I do have a little bit of heartburn about the CI matrix thing. And I know we talked about it, it was like over a year ago, and I apologize for not bringing it up at that meeting. But if I recall correctly, that when the ranking was done for high and low and up to 12, so forth, there was an assumption made, because didn't have staff capacity to really assess the ideas, that the ideas would have the outcome intended. And then they were scored to that effect. And I have a little heartburn over that assumption. And, for example, the one idea where you would have third-party reviews to kind of resolve technical differences or so forth. To some extent, I'm not sure that once people make up their minds that will resolve anything, myself, from my perspective, but that ranked very high. And it didn't occur to me until I was on the way home from the meeting that I kind of had that heartburn between making that assumption that it actually would work versus I'm kind of in the camp, I don't know that it would work. And that raises the expectation, because we even heard then later when we picked priorities to work on, that some of the ones that were ranked high we didn't pick. Now, I'm not saying throughout the CIA matrix, but is there some way to say that there's still further discussion to come or analyze these in order to clarify that, and when we have that on a list?
Board Member Nelson.
Yeah, I appreciate those thoughts, Board Member Nelson, and definitely something to think about. I think to some extent, like the example that you brought up, right? There's a lot of, I have a lot of questions about that one, of like how even to practically implement it and how you would build it. And so I think sort of adding this concept of readiness to at least demonstrate that there's a lot of questions might help too. And I will just note, we have said like the continuous improvement process is a process, but it also, like, we don't want it to be static. We don't need to keep it. We're supposed to continuously improve the continuous improvement process. So certainly, as we can, if we develop this list and use it, and as we move towards the next sort of full run, we could talk about how do we think about the matrix and how do we want to use it? And are there other things to add as we evaluate ideas? It's certainly something that, you know, we don't want to be changing it all the time, but not something that needs, like, we have the ability to add and think about other evaluation measures.
Why don't we go ahead and move on to Member Bauer Kemper?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Kayla, for walking us through this projects list topic. I'm wondering, Kayla, if you can help me out, probably remedially here, and my apologies for for my own failure to grasp things adequately. So would it be fair to say that the projects list gathers ideas and feeds them into the CI process, or would it be more accurate to say that the CI process is one of the sources for things that end up on the project list, along with the other sources mentioned here in the memo? I'm just trying to imagine the flow chart, and I'm probably imagining a far too simple two-dimensional flow chart, but can you help me see that a little better? Thanks.
Thank you for the question, Member Bauer-Kemper. I think that it's a little bit of both, which makes it a bit tricky because some of the ideas on the project list did come from things that we heard in the continuous improvement process solicitation. And it feels like a good list that we can share outwardly to say, you know, before the next solicitation happens, here are some projects that we already have on our list that we know are out there, and here's how they look and how we're envisioning them. And do you have anything more to add to these existing projects, or do you have new projects that you would like us to know about that you're thinking about? So I do think it feeds into the next solicitation process in that way as well. I don't know if I made that more confusing or helped.
Well, I appreciate that response. And I think as far as the questions that you have here, I guess I feel like since I don't fully understand how it's going to play out and what the project list is doing in relation to the CI process, I don't want to wait and see. I want to act and see, I guess, so that we can figure out how to most effectively interact the two together. Thanks.
Yeah, Board Member Bauer-Kemper, I was going to ask Sarah, if you would go back to the kind of wavy lines with the circle side. You know, we've had Board Member Bauer-Kemper, I know you are not the only person who's trying to sort of fit this in their own mind. How does it fit together? I think we all sort of have a grasp of it, but explain it in very different ways. So in my mind, it's helping us make our plan for implementation of improvements. And I think some of the ideas that we got for improvements are hard. They're not, by themselves, they're not a project. They're sort of a recommendation for a thing to do when you get to a project to change something. And I'm trying to think, I don't know if I can come up with an example off the top of my head. I actually have the improvements list in front of me, and I'm seeing if I can come up with something, you know, off the top of my head, or looking at this list here of something like, you know, we have a bunch of different things about training. Do a training on this thing, do a training on that thing, provide more guidance here that could be wrapped into more of a develop a comprehensive training program, and then the improvement ideas would sort of help guide us of what should be in there. So it's, some of them are suggestions that aren't projects, and to trying to make them into what is the work and what would we have to do to understand the whole breadth of what's needed to consider the improvement that was suggested. I don't know, I might have just muddied the waters there, I apologize, but I think it really is, it really to me fits in this planning portion of the improvement process, which is take the ideas we got and figure out how we can move them forward. And it's just thinking about it in a project-based way that fits more with the way we work plan than in an idea-based way.
If I can layer onto that a little bit, Catherine, it's, we had multiple ideas about that health impacts assessment and incorporating health into environmental review. And so it really takes all of those ideas, several 10, 50 ideas, and puts them into one singular work plan item of investigate the best way to add health into environmental review. And it starts taking many disparate ideas and putting them into work planning context and using that to plan and review here in the CI process. And then I know that when we were doing the CI process initially and asking for ideas, it was difficult to, they all came in very different formats. And so it was difficult to relate them to one another and to use them in a way that made sense to us to plan. And so we're hoping that this standardizes the approach to how people can also then present ideas as projects to us in the next solicitation.
Kayla. Board Member Smith. Board Member Smith, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see, one comment and two questions for you. So comment, I am a very visual viewer of information and details. So just a suggestion for if and or when the matrix comes to fruition, is there an opportunity for a stoplight chart or some sort of visual cue to identify priorities and what that might look like a green, amber, red, or, whatever it makes sense for staff to really pick up those cues. But that just, a quick snapshot when looking at something like this would be very helpful for me, I know, as I'm coming into this role and new information as we work through it. So that's just a suggestion or recommendation on the visual cue aspect. And then for the prioritization itself, is that currently nested? Is it a nested approach from either directed, whether that's legislative or otherwise directed priorities? And is it also incorporating like the grassroots push? So you're receiving comments, so that's more that grassroots bottom-up approach. Is it also taking into consideration those directed priorities that you get from other entities?
Thank you. Board Member Smith, and I'll let Executive Director Nussler answer that.
Yeah, I think board members, if we really kind of keep those separate, so there's the things that we are told to do are on their own. I mean, they're not on their own. Everything goes into the work plan. We start with what do we have to get done, and I think the continuous improvement process and this idea is a little bit more of the discretionary. So now, what improvements do we need to make to the program with the additional time that we have? So, and there's the matrix scoring was done, as we've talked about, and then a few things were put on the prior work plan, but I wouldn't say that otherwise the improvement list that we have is particularly prioritized in any way. So I'm really envisioning this as a list that, like, when I come to you all in the summer and say, here's what's on the work plan, I pulled these two things off the work plan, this one thing off the project list, and I put it on the work plan. And then you understand like what that components are. And if you want to discuss, well, why are we doing A instead of B? You have some understanding of like what the different resources might be in making that choice.
Okay. And then my second question is more of a mentality of, since history repeats itself and board members come and go, is this also intended to be an historic record of what has been done, whether it's maintained in a different location or on different sheets or whatever that looks like? Because I know for those of us newer to the board and coming in, a snapshot again, looking at the historic records or historic information would be very helpful just to see what has come up in the past and then how that was addressed and what might future recommendations look like. So just a question on that historical record keeping as well. Thank you.
I think that's a really great point. That was not necessarily something that I was thinking of. What I really had in mind was Kayla. What Kayla had said is sort of we've done a lot of asking in the past, and I think this is what we all want to get out of is continually asking for input and not being able to show what we're doing with it. And I don't want this to sit on a shelf. So this is kind of what I hope will be a living thing that, you know, even if we have only gotten through a little bit of it, you can, you know, when you step down and go to the next CD5 person, you go, well, there's a list. We should be working through it. And here's how it came from so that your point about like, if there are things that have been considered and discussed in the past and how that might inform that, I think that's definitely something to think about too. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I appreciate that as well. And I would just say that if I were stepping into the program now, I would first start by reading that continuous improvement report that MAD also helped us to create. I think it does a good job of looking at all of the past evaluations of the program and putting that all into one space to start fresh from moving forward. And then we can definitely keep that in mind and it may be a little more front and center through this list as well. So thank you for that.
Excellent. Thanks.
Board Member Smith. And other board members with comments or questions? Discussion, not seeing any others from board members. I think then we can go ahead and move on to offer the opportunity for the public to make any comments to us on the environmental review projects list at this point. So if you're here in person, we can call your name from the sign-up sheet and ask that you join us here to speak. We just have one in-person comment, is that right? And then for those online, please use the raise hand function if you'd like to comment or note it in the chat, and Colleen will call on you, and then you'll be able to unmute and speak online. And please be relatively brief with your remarks, and I'll let you know if we need to wrap up due to time. So with that, go ahead and, but 1 second.
We're gonna
Just do it from here.
sure, go ahead. We'll see if the camera can
Okay.
find you.
All right, short comment. My name is Berlin Schmally, Minneapolis, 12th Ward. In 2010, the Minnesota legislature directed MPCA to develop a rule to protect fish and aquatic life in surface waters from nitrogen and nitrates. Excuse me. MPCA spent the funds and did the work, which if I understand correctly, based on the science, would set the standard at 5 to 8 milligrams per liter. However, no rule has ever been proposed. 15 years and a lack of transparency into why. Calling the public members of this board, keep this as an agenda item until the rule is proposed. January 15th of each odd numbered year, PCA and the Department of Commerce are charged with a report on greenhouse gas emissions. It's after 2:15 on January 15th, the report has not been issued. Why? Public comment on the climate action framework ends on January 28th. The current greenhouse gas emissions data is 5 years old. On the surface, one can only conclude that the report is late due to prevent a fact-based public comment on the climate action framework. I hope that's not the case. Thanks.
Thank you for your comment. I think I'm understanding that as more of a general comment, not on the projects list topic.
The project, if I didn't fully understand that, but the CI priority included a rulemaking process. This rulemaking process has gone on for 15 years and it's never gotten to the point where the rule has been proposed. Why is that? and the public doesn't get it, hasn't been provided with a response. If Commissioner Kessler wants to provide a rule, explanation for why that rule hasn't been proposed, I'm willing to listen to it right now.
I think, yeah, we will note that as public comment and we'll put that in the comments for the minutes of the meeting.
And if the report's going to be issued, that's great. But if it's going to be late, can we explain why?
So why don't we go ahead and plan to follow up on that comment? You again for your comment.
Yeah, Chair
Kessler.
Daubenberger, can I just,
Okay.
this is Commissioner Kessler, and certainly I can follow up with Mr. Small and give him the link to the open public comment right now for our triennial water quality standards review, which does include the nitrate water quality standard, and it is woefully slow, which he has called out, but you know, he can call that out in writing and compel us to move faster. We have many priorities. And the greenhouse gas emissions report that Commerce and PCA produce is coming out imminently. It's going through the last little bits of review. I appreciate that Mr. Small called out that it is due today, and you will all see it shortly. So happy to follow up separately with information about the nitrate water quality standards rulemaking and the water quality standards prioritization list to him and others who are interested.
Thank you, Commissioner Kessler. All right, let's see. Do we have any? Thank you. Do we have any commenters online? And again, this is on the topic of the environmental review projects.
And there are
No commenters online.
Madam Chair, I just want to thank the board members for their input, and if you all, as you think about this, if you have other things that you want to see, please let me know. We'll be it sounds like we should move forward with crafting something like this, and then we will share it back with you as we go through our work planning process, which normally we kind of do in the summer. So stay tuned, and please, board members, again, if you have thoughts on like what would be really helpful to you in this list and help support your learning and understanding and work planning, I'm happy to hear it. Just let us know.
For that, Executive Director Nuschler. Appreciate the work on this environmental review projects list. More to come. Also appreciate all the discussion we've had on this today. So with that, I think we're going to take a 5-minute break. And so why don't we come back at 2:27. Thanks, everybody. Great. Well, thanks all for coming back from break. And that brings us to the next item on the agenda, which is an initial review of bylaws for EQB. And so Executive Director Nischler and others on her team have been working on these over the last few months and has a draft ready to talk through with us today. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Executive Director Nischler.
Thank you, Chair. So yes, you have in your packet a draft set of bylaws. Sarah, if you go ahead and go just straight to the next slide. As far as I can figure, looking back in and research, the board has never had like operating bylaws. We have operating procedures in Rule 4405. But I know that many of us don't sleep with our rule books under our pillows and look at them all the time. So those might not always be very helpful. So I've been talking with our attorney and looking at what we might be able to have to support effective governance of the board, to provide some clarity around authorities, responsibilities, and processes. And so really the idea of these bylaws is that they would supplement, not overrule or supersede the statute and rule about what we do. The statute and rule will always take precedence, but they don't speak to all situations. And so just as rules can fill in the blanks for statutes to set up more technical details, a set of bylaws could fill in some of the blanks for our procedural rules. And yes, it would provide some clarity and formality by putting everything in a document adopted by the board, as I said, because we don't all read our rule books every day. Some of these things might be in your board handbook, but I think there's also some value in the board speaking specifically to some of these authorities and responsibilities and formally adopting something. And so why now? I think in some of our past discussions over the past few months, there's just been questions about roles and who's doing what and authorities, things like that, that I think it would be really helpful to document. So next slide, please. I developed these bylaws working with our assigned Assistant Attorney General, Ann Keeling, who unfortunately can't be with us today. So if you have difficult legal questions, I will have to write them down and consult with her and get back to you. And also started from our statute and rules and other agency examples, as there are other state boards that have bylaws. These will look particularly familiar, I suspect, to Chair Holman, because I started from the Bowser bylaws with me. So the goal was to provide a useful framework without going into a level of detail that would make them overly restrictive or in need of constant revision. So they're focused on those key items that support the clarity in authorities and roles. So for example, the responsibilities of the chair are generally included in the rules. This tries to provide a little more information on the vice chair role, which of course we will vote on next month. A reminder, in February, we have to select a vice chair, and also roles for our general membership. Provides a little more clarity on subcommittees. They're allowed by statute, but these include some more specific requirements like size, things like that. Provide some information about meetings by bringing together requirements from different sources, both EQB specific sources and some general state requirements, like some clarity around closed meetings and about the need for example, roll call votes when anyone is meeting via hybrid or virtual technology. There's also the roles of the staff and the director. The staff and the director roles have been in place for a long time, but they're not specifically mentioned in statute. Instead, the MPCA is charged with providing staff support. So one key outcome of the bylaws, I hope, will be to define some of the staff and director roles so it's clear where we have latitude and responsibility to act on your behalf. The draft at this point focuses on the environmental review role because that's the role that has the most specific responsibilities in statute and rule. I already know that there's been some suggestions to add some additional clarity around other staff roles in the bylaws. So that is on my mind. Next slide, please, Sarah. So today we have this preliminary draft, and I would love to hear from you. I'm not going to walk through it, but I'd love to hear some thoughts from you of is there anything unclear or confusing? Do the draft bylaws include too much, something that you think goes beyond the roles or authorities or processes and might be difficult for us to work through in the future? And are there additional items that you want to see addressed in the bylaws? And once we understand kind of where we're at there, we can identify what kinds of changes are needed and how those should get made, and if there's particular conversations you want to have about any of them. And then they would be adopted at a future meeting. The best practices for bylaws is generally you don't adopt them on the time you first see them. We originally was thinking we might bring them back next month if there aren't significant changes, but in talking to some of you and in talking about sort of processes, I think there's also a desire to understand a little more board procedure and Robert's rules. And so next month, we're going to talk a little bit about some of that and probably a little bit about how that is addressed in the bylaws, and start there, and then bring more detailed bylaws back probably at a future meeting that is not next month, but perhaps April, I suppose, would be the most likely. So that's what we're thinking about in terms of next steps. And that is my my short presentation for you all. And so I'm just interested this time, Madam Chair, about what everyone thinks about what else might be needed.
Yes, thank you for drafting the bylaws and the work of your team to help do that. And I think it's a great start. And I think we have a comment or question by Chair Holman. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. And Catherine, one of the questions I have for the board and us, all of us, is there enough clarity in the bylaw draft for how board members or public or staff members bring things to the agenda? And that always is kind of, every board I've been on, that's kind of been a challenge. Does it take two members to kind of bring an idea forward? I was on a city council where you had to have two council members before the mayor would put it on. And there are all kinds of iterations of that. But do you feel like this iteration or this draft gives clarity to staff and to the chair as to how agenda items become brought forth? Because I think the potential exists for whoever wants to bring an agenda item for the board's consideration forward, whether it's board, staff, or public, that if you try and don't know the procedure or it isn't identified in the bylaws, you can easily become disenfranchised or feel not listened to or intentionally set aside. And I think that's not our point, if we have a good, clear route. So my question is the language as presented seemingly clear, primarily to staff, how things get onto the agenda?
Yeah, thank you for that comment or question about that. And I appreciate you bringing that up. Because we don't want board members to be disenfranchised about how that can come about where you get items on the agenda. So note that, unless you want to say anything about that right now, Kathy.
I will just say that is something I looked at closely and tried to reflect, but definitely open to people saying they need more.
Thank you. All right. Any additional questions or comments? I see Board Member Smith. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chair. And Director Neuschuler, you already mentioned this, but just to reiterate that idea of ensuring there's clarity around the other program staff outside of just the environmental review program staff. So I know you just mentioned it, but I just thought I would reiterate. That was one of the key things I noticed as I was reading through. And I also appreciate Chair Holman's for that idea of how to best bring agenda items forward. Sometimes it can be very informal, but in a more formalized board process, it does make sense to outline that process. So much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Smith. Other board member comments or questions? Oh, Board Member Bauerkemper, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Executive Director Nuschler, for presenting this for the first round. So one question, and then a comment. Maybe first the comment in relation to this agenda setting. So Chair Holman and Member Smith have referenced the process for getting things onto the agenda and whether or not it's clear. And I suppose I would also want us to have a discussion of the substance of how things get on the agenda. So it seems relatively clear within this that things are submitted to the executive director, and then the chair has discretion to determine which items end up on the agenda. But it might be that we would want to have a discussion as to another route solely on discretion of the chair. So if we don't want to have a different pathway, that's fine, if that's the consensus, at least as far as I'm concerned. But I just want to maybe reiterate the question, or maybe ask a question that is on that same topic, but a little bit different, as to whether or not we would want to have a pathway for agenda items that doesn't rely solely on the discretion of the chair. So that's maybe a topic for our ongoing discussion as we continue to consider these bylaws. Then my question is, were you all able, whether procedurally or as a practical matter, were you able to take the input that you received during the briefing last week? Is that still on the list somewhere of something to look at, or do we need to reiterate those things now in this context for some formal purpose?
Board Member Bauerkemper, I know you had a question and I looked it up, but why don't you go ahead and repeat it, and I'll answer it since I didn't work it into my presentation.
Oh yeah, you might actually have to help me remember it, frankly. But it had to do both with the not public or the non-public data, and then there was another small thing about passing, when we do decide to implement these, are we using the amendment procedure and the 2/3, and is it 2/3 of the quorum or 2/3 of the what? Or is it a majority of quorum or a majority of the board? How do we get these into effect in the first place in relation to the amending procedure, and making sure we all understand what we're talking about when we say a vote of the board and a 2/3 vote and those things? Thanks.
So starting with the discussion about board members can't share non-public information under 13.37. I went and looked at the definitions, and Minnesota Statute 13.02, I believe it contains a definition for non-public data and a definition for not public data. And I don't know if I can print out a copy. It's not sitting in front of me, but the one that is in the bylaws is the broader term, and the definition of the term that is in the bylaws includes the other term. So it is written a little strangely in the statute, where not public and non-public seem to be the same. But I think the definition of not public includes X, Y, Z, and non-public data. So I checked, it does seem to be the right definition under the statute, but that is something that I will flag for the attorney to double check. So that was question one. Question two was concerning the adoption and the amendment. And I think, so the adoption, it isn't clear exactly what a majority is. In going back to the EQB procedural rules, we are required to have a quorum to conduct business, but all votes actually need to be a majority of all members of the board, excluding vacancies. So if we have a quorum and we vote on something, but then, if we barely have a quorum, for example, if we have 9 people and then not everybody votes in favor, even if it's a majority of who's here, it might not pass because we need a majority of all members of the board. That's the way our rules are written. So that's how a majority should always be construed. And we could clarify that in the bylaws, that that's what our rules say. And then the point of, I think, the amendment being a larger number, a 2/3, is just to make it so it can't be changed willy-nilly, but that certainly would be up to the board's discretion, and particularly knowing that a majority vote always means every filled seat. We could certainly consider changing that and just making it a majority rather than 2/3. I think that just was what was in some of the other examples I was looking at.
Go ahead, Board Member Bauer-Kemper.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Executive Director Nuschler. So then as we hammer out the language on that last little article there, maybe consult with our AG delegate to decide if it's 2/3 of the quorum or 2/3 of the eligible number of votes. Kind of whether, essentially I'm asking whether or not the policies and procedures applies to the 2/3 or how the 2/3 is interpreted. We might as well just be explicit what we mean by that within here. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Board Member Bauer-Kemper. And on your previous comment too, I am certainly open to exploring ways to bring things to the agenda outside of the chair's discretion. Although I will say I don't know of an instance in my couple years of being chair where I didn't bring something forward, although I think there have been times where we wait a meeting or two to get more information. But I do recognize I'm not going to be the chair forever and ever too. So we can certainly give that some additional thought. Board Member Bauer-Kemper.
Yeah, just wanted to say thank you, Chair. Appreciate your grace on that matter, and I trust that you know that I wasn't referring to your practices. I think we're happy with the language described with our current chair, but we've got a plan for the chair we might get someday. So much gratitude for that. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Other questions or comments? All right. Well, I think that good discussion. This gives us some more to consider and think about as we further review and discuss bylaws. And as Director Nuschler mentioned, we'll bring this back in a future meeting here soon. Oh, we've got another hand up. Go ahead, Board Member Martin.
Sorry, I was a little slow, but I just had one thing that I wanted to ask whether it ought to be clarified. This is between the duties of the chair and the duties of the vice chair. And so under the duties of the vice chair, it first is to perform those duties delegated to the chair. It kind of suggests like, I'll tell the vice chair what they want to have done, which, Commissioner Murphy has always done and has never consisted in anything more than presiding for a meeting. So that says one thing, but then it says in B, it says to act as the chair in illness, disability, etc. Act as the chair includes a whole bunch more things under M3. So I think I'm not saying the vice chair should have all those powers, but I'm saying like maybe it should be a little clearer if it's intentional to have the vice chair only do those things that the chair delegates. That seems a little contradictory between 4A and 4B in that section. Am I making any sense?
Thank you, Board Member Martin. It was coming over a little choppy here on my end of things. I think I got about 90% of what you said. Do you think, Director Nuschler, you heard most of that? You wanna?
Yeah, I think I did hear that. So and it may be
usually not 90% of what I say is coherent anyway. So maybe you got the best parts. I don't know.
No, that's. Speak very coherently. It's just the audio today.
I think perhaps Board Member Martin, it's maybe on an order of operations situation, and then we should have written B first and put A at the bottom, sort of like your primary duty is to act as the chair in the event that the chair can't, including to call special meetings, and then to perform and like duties if specifically delegated. So maybe there's some clarity there, maybe some reordering might bring to it potentially, we can look at that for sure. A lot of that is in rule. We can look at clarity there, if that might help.
Okay, yeah, I think that would help. And partly I'm thinking about it. Can you hear me right now?
Pretty much, yes.
Partly I'm thinking about it because in the past, at least couple rotations, the vice chair has been a public member, not a state employee. So there are some of the things that the chair does that it doesn't seem like a public member probably would want to or be able to do, like hiring consultants or reviewing the executive director. So maybe those are intentionally excluded. Maybe it could just use a little clarification.
Oh, okay, yes, good point. Thank you for that example that you just brought up there. So we'll take another look at that with the lens with that in mind. You, Board Member Martin. The others before we move on. Great. Well, really appreciate the comments that were brought forth here today. And as I mentioned, we'll have further discussion on this at future board meetings soon. All right, so why don't we go ahead and again, thank you, Executive Director Nuschler, and to your team for drafting these. And at this point, we'll go ahead and move on in the agenda to number 7, the public comment periods. This is the general public comment period. It's one where take comments on anything and appreciate the comment that was brought forth during the environmental review public comment period too. But with that, if you've signed up on the in-person sheet, I don't think we have anyone here in person any longer. That's great. But also if you're online, raise your hand in Teams if you'd like to comment. And we will go ahead and notify you and take you off of mute at that point if you're online. So that have any online commenters?
Not at this time yet.
Okay, we'll just give it a moment to see if anyone raises their hand. All right, why don't we go ahead and conclude the public comment period, since I don't think we had any additional public comments beyond what we heard earlier. So appreciate that comment that was provided earlier. And with that, we'll go ahead and move on to the closing and adjournment of the meeting. And once again, especially for those who might not have been on the meeting in the very beginning, I was mentioning that when we do meetings that are hybrid or all virtual like this meeting, we are going to need to go ahead and go through like a roll call vote to make sure everybody is heard. So we'll do that for the adjournment here too. So want to first thank all board members for their participation today and the thoughtful discussion. And we have reached the end of the agenda. So with that, is there a motion to adjourn the meeting?
This is Commissioner Kessler. I can make that motion.
Thank you,
Second,
Commissioner
Holman.
Jackson. Thank you, Chair Holman, for that second. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, we'll go on to a roll call vote to adjourn.
All right, Commissioner Arnold, I believe is not present. Board Member Bakken, I believe is not present. Board Member Bauer-Kemper,
Yes.
Board Member Brands,
Yes.
I believe Board Member Cunningham is not present. Chair Daubenberger,
Yes.
Commissioner Grunwald,
Yes.
Board Member Hintz,
Yes.
Board Member Katzenberger.
Yes, but I do have a point of order quickly, just for the next time. Generally, Robert's Rules doesn't require a vote on adjourning, because if we lost members during the thing and lost our quorum, we wouldn't be able to adjourn the meeting. But I vote yes in any case.
This is why we're having Robert's Rules training next
I
month.
learn something every day. Yes, thank you, Board Member Katzenberger.
All right, we'll finish it out though. Commissioner Kessler, On adjournment,
Yes, thanks.
Board Member Martin,
Yes.
Commissioner Verelek is not with us. Board Member Nelson,
Yes.
Commissioner Peterson's not with us. Board Member Smith,
Yes.
Commissioner Stroman is not with us, and Chair Holman.
Yes.
Okay. No opposing votes for adjourning the meeting. With that, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you all again.
You well.
Thank you.
Good one. Bye-bye.